Have you ever felt like giving up on English, on love, or even on your dream of building a new life in America? In this video, I'll share a real story from my own journey living and working in the United States, how a shy conversation in simple English slowly turned into love, and how that love led to a wedding like no other. A quiet story about culture, courage, and the surprising power of small words. The question that started everything. What if the real reason you want to quit learning English isn't because English is hard? That question hit me one cold morning in the United States, standing outside a small coffee shop with a paper cup warming my hands and 1,000 doubts running through my head. I had already been living and working in America for a while, but something inside me felt stuck. My English was still slow. My sentences were simple. And sometimes, when people spoke quickly around me, the words sounded like a fast river rushing past my ears. For a moment, I honestly thought about giving up. Not just giving up on practicing English. I mean giving up on the whole dream that brought me to this country. Life in America looked exciting from far away. Bright cities, friendly people, big opportunities. But real life here also comes with quiet mornings when you feel alone, awkward conversations where you search for the right word, and long days when your brain feels tired from translating every thought. That morning, the air was sharp and cold. The kind of cold that makes your breath visible like little clouds. I remember standing there thinking something very simple. Maybe this is not for me. And that thought is more common than most people admit. Psychologists actually talk about something called cognitive fatigue. When your brain constantly processes information in a second language, it uses far more energy than usual. Studies from universities in the United States show that bilingual processing can increase mental workload by up to 40% during conversation. In simple words, your brain gets tired faster. So if learning English sometimes feels exhausting, that doesn't mean you're bad at it. It means your brain is working very, very hard. I didn't understand that at the time. All I knew was that I felt slow. When coworkers joked together, I laughed a few seconds later. When someone asked me a question, I needed time to answer. Small things, but they build up. Inside that coffee shop, people were chatting, ordering drinks, laughing easily in English. Words flowed smoothly between them like music. Meanwhile, my brain was still practicing basic sentences. I would like a coffee, please. Thank you. Have a nice day. Simple English. Slow English. But something strange happened that morning. Instead of walking away, I stayed. Not because I suddenly became confident. Actually, I stayed because of a very small moment that most people would probably forget. The barista smiled and asked me a simple question. Cold morning, right? Just 5 syllables. Cold. Morning. Right. Nothing complicated. But for some reason, that sentence felt like an open door. I nodded and answered carefully. Yes, very cold today. That was it. A tiny conversation. Maybe 6 words from me. But something inside my brain relaxed. Language experts often explain this using something called low-pressure communication. When conversations are short, simple, and friendly, the brain stops panicking. Instead of worrying about grammar, it focuses on meaning. And meaning is the real purpose of language. Not perfection. That small interaction reminded me of something important. English is not a test you must pass. It is a bridge between people. That day, standing with my coffee, I started noticing little things around me. A couple near the window was quietly talking and laughing. Two students were studying together with laptops open. Someone was reading a book while soft music played in the background. Ordinary life in America. Yet for me, it felt like watching a movie where I was still learning my role. But here's the twist that makes this story interesting. That morning, the morning I almost gave up on English, was also the morning that slowly started the biggest change in my life. Because inside that same coffee shop, only a few minutes later, someone walked in who would eventually become the most important person in my American story. At the time, I had no idea. I was just a quiet immigrant trying to survive another day of simple English conversations. But life loves irony. The day you think nothing is happening, sometimes becomes the first page of a completely new chapter. And if someone had told me then that this awkward English journey would lead to something unexpected, something as big as a wedding unlike any other, I probably would have laughed. A unique wedding? In America? With my English? That sounded impossible. Yet real life has a strange habit of surprising us. Many success stories actually begin at the exact moment people almost quit. Behavioral scientists call this the persistence threshold, the point where frustration reaches its peak right before progress begins. Think about learning to ride a bicycle. Right before you balance for the first time, you fall again and again. Learning a language works the same way. Your brain struggles until suddenly something clicks. That morning was my almost quit moment. But instead of quitting, I finished my coffee, took a deep breath, and decided something very simple. Just one more conversation today. Not perfect English. Just real English. One more small step. Looking back now, that tiny decision changed everything. It started a journey that would teach me about American culture, love, family, and courage in ways I never expected. And eventually, it would lead to a wedding story that friends still talk about today. A wedding that was simple, unusual, emotional, and very different from traditional ones. But before that day ever happened, there were many small steps. Awkward conversations. Cultural surprises. Moments of doubt. And one unexpected meeting that turned ordinary life in America into something unforgettable. So the real question is not whether English is difficult. The real question is this. What if the sentence you practice tomorrow leads to the most important conversation of your life? Because sometimes the journey to something extraordinary begins with the simplest words in the world. Good morning. Nice to meet you. And maybe a quiet cup of coffee on a cold American day. My first days living in America. Snow was the first surprise. Not the beautiful snow you see in movies. Not the soft white snow where people smile and throw snowballs. I'm talking about the kind of snow that makes your face hurt when the wind blows and makes the streets look quiet and empty at 6 in the morning. That was one of the first lessons America taught me. Dreams look different when the weather is cold. When I first arrived in the United States to live and work, everything felt bigger than I imagined. The roads were wider. The buildings were taller. Even the supermarkets felt like small cities. But the biggest difference wasn't the size of things. It was the silence inside my head. Back home, words came easily. I could joke, argue, explain ideas, tell stories. Language flowed naturally like breathing. But in America, during those first weeks, my brain suddenly felt slow. Every sentence required effort. If someone asked, "How was your weekend?" my brain immediately started translating. Weekend, how was, answer politely, choose the right tense. By the time I formed my response, the conversation had already moved somewhere else. And that's when a strange psychological effect appears for many people learning a second language. Researchers call it the silent personality effect. Studies from language psychology departments in the U.S. show that people often appear quieter or more shy in a second language, not because they are shy, but because their brain is busy processing information. In other words, your personality gets temporarily trapped behind your vocabulary. That's exactly how I felt. At work, people were friendly. Americans are actually very open in daily conversation. Coworkers said things like, "Hey, how's it going? Good morning. Busy day today, huh?" Short sentences. Casual English. But even those simple phrases felt like puzzles at first. Sometimes I answered too formally. Sometimes I answered too late. Sometimes I just smiled and nodded. But slowly, something interesting started happening. My brain began collecting patterns. For example, I noticed Americans use certain expressions constantly. Words like awesome, pretty good, or not bad. Conversations didn't have to be perfect. They just had to be natural. That realization changed my learning strategy. Instead of memorizing long grammar rules, I started focusing on real everyday English. The kind people actually use. Sounds good. Yeah, that makes sense. Let's do it. These small phrases became tools for survival. And the funny part is that neuroscience supports this approach. According to research on chunk learning in language acquisition, the brain learns faster when it remembers common phrases instead of isolated vocabulary words. It's like building with Lego blocks instead of loose pieces. Little by little, my confidence improved. Still, life outside of work was another challenge. Evenings were quiet. In a new country, silence can feel heavier than usual. Your family is far away. Your childhood friends are thousands of miles away. And sometimes the only voice you hear for hours is your own. Those moments test your motivation. Many people reach this stage and start thinking about going home. I understood that feeling very well. But I also noticed something else during those quiet nights. America is a country where strangers talk to each other more than you might expect. In elevators. In grocery stores. In coffee shops. Small conversations everywhere. At first I avoided them. My brain preferred safety. But curiosity slowly replaced fear. One evening after work, I stopped by a small grocery store near my apartment. The cashier looked at my basket, bread, eggs, and coffee, and laughed gently. "Looks like someone's making breakfast for dinner." I froze for half a second. Breakfast, dinner, what did she mean? Then my brain understood the joke. I smiled and answered carefully. "Yes, breakfast is easier." She laughed again. "Honestly, same here." 10 seconds of conversation. Nothing important. Yet moments like that started changing the way I experienced America. Language stopped feeling like a wall. It became more like a door that opened slowly. And each small interaction built a little more courage. Looking back now, those early days were not just about learning English. They were about learning how to live inside a new culture. In the United States, independence is highly valued. People respect personal space. At the same time, friendliness is part of daily life. Someone might hold the door open for you. A stranger might compliment your jacket. A coworker might ask about your weekend even if they only know you a little. These things seem small, but they create a social rhythm. Once you understand that rhythm, conversations feel easier. Still, during those first months, I had no idea that my routine life, work, groceries, coffee shops, was quietly moving me towards something unexpected. Because somewhere inside that same neighborhood, in one of those ordinary places, I was about to meet someone who would completely change my American story. At that time, I was simply trying to build a stable life. Work hard. Practice English. Adapt to the culture. Normal goals. But life rarely follows a predictable script. Sometimes the most important moments appear when you're doing something completely ordinary, ordering coffee, walking into a store, or starting a simple conversation. And one day soon, inside a small coffee shop on another cold American morning, a conversation even simpler than the others would begin. A conversation that started with slow English, awkward smiles, and a sentence so ordinary that no one else in the room would remember it. But that small moment would eventually lead to something neither of us expected. A love story. And a wedding that turned out to be very different from traditional ones. Not big. Not fancy. But unforgettable. And strangely enough, the whole story began with the same thing that once made me want to quit. A simple conversation in imperfect English. The coffee shop where we met. Some life-changing moments arrive with fireworks. Others arrive quietly, while someone is deciding between a latte and a cappuccino. The moment I met her looked completely ordinary. It was another cold morning in the United States, the kind of morning where people walk quickly, shoulders slightly raised against the wind, coffee cups held like tiny heaters. I pushed open the door of the same small neighborhood coffee shop I had started visiting almost every day. The warm air inside smelled like roasted coffee beans and toasted bread. Soft music played in the background. And for the first time since moving to America, that place started to feel a little familiar. Familiar places are important when you live in a new country. Psychologists often explain that the human brain searches for predictable environments to reduce stress. When you repeatedly visit the same cafe, grocery store, or park, your brain relaxes because it recognizes patterns. The same faces. The same sounds. The same routine. For someone learning a new language, these small islands of familiarity are powerful. That morning, I ordered my usual drink. Medium coffee, please. My pronunciation was still careful and slow, but the barista already knew me. Coming right up, he said with a smile. I stepped aside to wait, scrolling casually through my phone, thinking about the long workday ahead. Nothing about that moment suggested that anything unusual was about to happen. Then the door opened again. A woman walked in quickly, brushing a little snow off her coat. Her cheeks were slightly red from the cold, and she looked around the shop as if searching for something. Or maybe someone. At first, I barely noticed. But then something small happened. She stepped toward the counter, looked at the menu for a moment, and then quietly said something to the barista. I didn't catch the full sentence, but I heard 3 words clearly. Still learning English. My brain immediately reacted. Not because her English was bad. Actually, it was very good. But those 3 words felt familiar in a deep way. Still learning English. I turned slightly, curious. She was explaining something about the menu, laughing a little at herself. Sorry. I'm still learning English. The barista waved his hand kindly. No worries at all. Moments like this happen thousands of times every day in America. The country is full of people from different backgrounds, different languages, different stories. Hearing someone say they are learning English is completely normal. But for me, that sentence created an instant connection. Language learners often recognize each other without trying. It's almost like a secret club. You notice the pauses, the careful pronunciation, the tiny moments when someone searches for the right word. Your brain understands the effort behind the sentence. At that moment, I suddenly felt less alone. When her coffee was ready, she stepped aside to wait, standing just a few feet away from me. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The quiet felt slightly awkward, the way silence sometimes feels between strangers who are not sure if they should talk. My brain started debating with itself. Say something. No, don't say something. What if your English sounds strange? What if the conversation becomes uncomfortable? This internal debate is extremely common. Behavioral psychologists call it the hesitation loop. The brain tries to protect you from embarrassment by encouraging silence. But silence also protects you from connection. And sometimes, breaking that silence requires only one small risk. I looked up and smiled politely. Cold morning today. Yes. That same sentence again. Cold morning today. For simple words. She looked at me, slightly surprised for a moment, and then smiled back. Yes, very cold. Her accent was different from mine, but the effort in her voice felt familiar. We both laughed a little, the way people laugh when they recognize a shared situation. You live around here, she asked slowly. Yes, I said. Nearby. The conversation was simple. Very simple. But interestingly, this kind of simple conversation is exactly how most friendships and relationships begin. Social scientists studying human connection have found that many long-term relationships start with what they call micro-interactions, tiny, casual exchanges that slowly build trust. Not dramatic speeches. Just small moments repeated over time. Our conversation that morning lasted maybe 2 minutes. We talked about the cold weather. About work. About how strange American winters can feel if you didn't grow up with them. At one point she laughed and said something that stayed in my memory. Winter here teaches patience. That sentence sounded poetic in a quiet way. Before either of us realized it, our coffees were ready and people behind us were moving around the shop. The morning rush was beginning. She picked up her cup. Well, nice meeting you, she said. Nice meeting you too, I replied. Simple. Ordinary. If someone had taken a photo of that moment, it would look completely unremarkable. 2 strangers having a short conversation in a small American cafe. But life rarely announces the importance of a moment while it's happening. You only understand later. What neither of us knew then was that this small coffee shop conversation would not be the last. Not even close. Because once 2 people discover that they share the same challenge, learning a language, adapting to a culture, building a life in a new country, something interesting happens. Curiosity grows. And curiosity has a way of pulling people back into the same places again and again. The same cafe. The same counter. The same warm smell of coffee on cold mornings. And the next time we met, the conversation would be slightly longer. Still simple English. Still slow. Still a little awkward. But each conversation would reveal something new about life in America, and about each other. At that point, of course, I had no idea that the woman I had just met would eventually become the center of a story that would lead to a wedding unlike any other. For now, she was simply a stranger with a warm smile and a familiar sentence. I'm still learning English. Sometimes the beginning of something extraordinary sounds exactly like that. Our awkward English conversations. The strange thing about love stories is that they rarely begin with perfect sentences. Most movies show romance starting with confident words, clever jokes, or beautiful speeches. But in real life, especially when two people are speaking a language they are still learning, conversations look very different. They are slower. Sometimes clumsy. Sometimes funny in ways no one planned. And strangely enough, those imperfect conversations often become the strongest memories later. A few days after our first meeting in the coffee shop, I walked in again early in the morning. The same warm smell of coffee filled the room, and the same quiet music played in the background. But this time something felt slightly different. She was already there. Sitting near the window with a cup of coffee and a laptop open in front of her. For a moment I hesitated near the door. My brain instantly started its familiar internal debate. Should I say hello? What if she doesn't remember me? What if the conversation becomes awkward? Psychologists explain this reaction using something called social risk perception. The brain treats small social interactions like tiny risks. Even saying hello to someone you met once can feel surprisingly difficult. But there is another interesting fact. The brain also remembers positive interactions very strongly. So when she looked up, recognized me, and smiled immediately, the tension disappeared. "Oh, hi," she said. That simple reaction made everything easier. I walked over and sat at the table across from her. "How are you?" I asked slowly. "Good," she said. "Just working a little." Her English was careful, like mine. Not broken, not perfect, just thoughtful. Each sentence felt like it was chosen deliberately. And that became the style of our conversations. Slow English. Clear words. Short sentences. At first, we talked about simple things. Work. Weather. Food. Life in America. But something interesting happens when two people share the experience of learning a language. Conversations become more patient. Instead of interrupting or speaking quickly, both people naturally slow down. Language researchers sometimes call this cooperative communication. When speakers know the conversation requires effort, they become more supportive without even thinking about it. That was exactly what happened with us. If one of us forgot a word, the other waited. If a sentence took longer to finish, no one rushed it. Instead of feeling embarrassed about mistakes, we sometimes laughed about them. One morning she tried to explain something about cooking. I made, how to say, the long pasta. Spaghetti? I suggested. Yes. Spaghetti, she laughed. But I cooked too long. It became very soft. Mushy, I said. Yes. Mushy spaghetti, she repeated, laughing again. Moments like that sound small, but they create something powerful. Comfort. And comfort is the secret ingredient in communication. The more comfortable you feel, the more your brain relaxes. And when your brain relaxes, language becomes easier. Neuroscientists explain that stress activates the brain's threat system, which reduces cognitive flexibility. In simple words, anxiety blocks learning. But laughter does the opposite. It opens the brain. So those awkward conversations actually helped both of us improve our English faster than we realized. Weeks passed. Our coffee shop meetings became more frequent. Not every day, but often enough that seeing each other there started to feel natural. Sometimes we talked for 10 minutes. Sometimes for 30. One morning we discovered something surprising. We had both moved to the United States for similar reasons. New opportunities. A different life. A fresh start. That discovery created another layer of connection. Living in America as a newcomer can feel like exploring a giant puzzle. Every day brings small discoveries: how tipping works, why supermarkets sell 20 types of bread, why strangers ask how's it going even when they don't expect a long answer. Sharing those discoveries with someone who understands the experience makes the journey easier. One afternoon she told me something interesting. In my first month here, she said slowly, I practiced English by talking to myself. I laughed. I still do that sometimes. She looked relieved. Really? Yes, I said. Sometimes in my car. We both laughed again. Language teachers actually recommend this technique. It's called self-directed speaking practice. Talking to yourself allows the brain to rehearse sentences without social pressure. Athletes use a similar method called mental rehearsal to improve performance. So our strange habit turned out to be scientifically supported. But at that time, we were simply two people sharing stories. Slowly, the conversations moved beyond basic topics. We talked about childhood memories. About family traditions. About the surprising differences between cultures. One day she asked a question that made me pause for a moment. What surprised you most about America? I thought carefully before answering. People talk to strangers more than I expected. She nodded. Yes. I noticed that too. Then she smiled slightly and added something interesting. And sometimes strangers become important. At that moment, the sentence sounded casual. Just another observation. But looking back now, it feels almost like a quiet prediction. Because our strange friendship, built on simple English, shared mistakes, and many cups of coffee, was slowly becoming something deeper. Not suddenly. Not dramatically. Just gradually. Like learning a language itself. And somewhere inside those slow conversations, without either of us planning it, something new was beginning to grow. A connection stronger than small talk. Stronger than coincidence. Still quiet. Still uncertain. But moving steadily toward a future neither of us could see yet. A future that would eventually lead to a very unusual idea. An idea about a wedding that would surprise almost everyone who heard about it. But before that idea appeared, there were still many conversations ahead. More coffee. more laughter, and many more imperfect English sentences that somehow brought two lives closer together. Discovering American culture together. The funny thing about culture shock is that it rarely arrives as a big dramatic moment. Instead, it sneaks into your life through very small surprises. A supermarket aisle that sells 30 types of cereal. A stranger smiling at you while walking a dog. A coworker saying, "Let's grab lunch sometime," and actually meaning it. During those early months of knowing each other, many of our conversations in the coffee shop slowly turned into little discoveries about American life. Sometimes we talked about language. Sometimes about work. But very often, we talked about the strange, fascinating details of living in the United States. One morning she arrived looking slightly confused. "I have a question," she said. "Okay," I replied. She leaned closer and lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "Why do Americans put ice in everything?" I laughed immediately. Because I had wondered the exact same thing. Coffee? Ice. Soda? Ice. Water? A lot of ice. Even when the weather outside was freezing. These small cultural differences might sound unimportant, but anthropologists say they play a big role in how people experience a new country. When you move somewhere unfamiliar, your brain constantly compares what you see with what you already know. Every difference becomes a tiny puzzle. And solving those puzzles slowly helps you feel more comfortable in the new environment. That morning we spent nearly 20 minutes discussing ice in American drinks. It might have been the most unnecessary cultural analysis ever conducted inside a coffee shop, but it made both of us laugh. And laughter makes learning stick. Psychologists often say humor increases memory retention because it activates emotional processing in the brain. In simple words, when something is funny, your brain remembers it better. So apparently, jokes about ice cubes were helping our English too. But culture in America goes far beyond food or drinks. Over time, our conversations moved into deeper topics, family, relationships, and how people approach life here. One afternoon she told me something interesting about American weddings. In the U.S., she said slowly, many couples plan weddings that show their personality. I nodded. Yes. I noticed that. In some countries, weddings follow very traditional structures. Families expect certain ceremonies, certain clothing, certain rituals. The event often represents family history and social expectations. But in America, weddings can be extremely creative. Some couples marry on beaches. Some marry in forests. Some marry in small backyards with only close friends. Some even write their own vows instead of repeating traditional ones. This idea fascinated both of us. A wedding as personal expression. Not just a formal ceremony. At that time, of course, we were not talking about our own wedding. That thought still felt far away. But the concept stayed in our minds. One evening we decided to explore the city a little after work. Walking through American neighborhoods can feel like reading a story about everyday life. Small houses with front porches. People jogging with headphones. Families walking dogs. At one point we passed a small park where a couple seemed to be taking wedding photos. The bride was laughing while trying to keep her dress from touching the grass. The groom looked both nervous and extremely happy. Photographers moved around them, capturing every moment. We stopped for a second, watching quietly. That looks stressful, she joked. Yes, I said. But also exciting. Weddings in America often represent something bigger than a celebration. They are a moment where two people publicly choose to build a life together. In psychological research, marriage ceremonies are considered powerful commitment signals, social events that strengthen emotional bonds because they involve friends, family, and shared memories. Standing in that park, we were simply observers. Two people learning about a new culture. But the idea of commitment, of building a life in this country, was already becoming part of our conversations. Sometimes we talked about the future. Where we wanted to live. What kind of life we imagined in the United States. Those conversations were still light and playful, but they revealed something important. Both of us had come to America not just for work, but for possibility. A new chapter. A place where life could be designed differently. And that belief slowly brought us closer. Another cultural discovery came during a small dinner gathering with some coworkers. Americans often invite friends for casual dinners at home. Nothing formal, just simple food, conversation, maybe music in the background. That evening we watched how naturally people shared stories about their lives. Childhood memories. Funny travel experiences. Dreams for the future. In many ways, American social culture encourages openness. People value authenticity and personal stories. Listening to those conversations gave both of us confidence to share more about ourselves too. After dinner, while walking back to the car, she said something thoughtful. I think people here believe life can always change. I thought about that for a moment. Yes, I said. Maybe that's why so many people come here. Hope is powerful. And sometimes hope grows quietly between two people who are simply trying to understand a new world together. Weeks continued passing. Our coffee shop meetings became a normal part of life. Our conversations became deeper. And slowly, without planning it, we were no longer just two strangers learning English. We were two people building trust. Learning about culture. Learning about each other. Still, neither of us realized yet where this path was leading. Because the biggest tests, the moments that would challenge our relationship, our plans, and even our future in America, had not appeared yet. And when those challenges finally arrived, they would force us to ask a difficult question. Was this connection strong enough to survive the complicated realities of life in a new country? The answer would change everything. When life tested our relationship. Every love story eventually reaches a moment when the easy conversations stop. Not because the feelings disappear, but because real life finally enters the room. Until that point, our connection had grown naturally, coffee shop talks, walks through quiet American neighborhoods, conversations about culture and language. Everything felt calm, steady, almost comfortable. But life in a new country has a way of testing people when they least expect it. And the test usually arrives quietly. Not with drama. Just pressure. The first sign appeared during a normal weekday afternoon. She texted me a short message. Can we talk later? 4 words. Short messages like that can make the human brain imagine 100 different problems. Psychologists call this anticipatory anxiety. The mind tries to predict danger before it actually exists. When we met that evening, she looked tired. Not physically tired, but mentally exhausted. Work had become difficult. Deadlines were increasing, responsibilities were changing, and the stress of maintaining stability in a new country had started to build. Anyone who has moved to another country understands this phase. The excitement of the first month slowly fades, and reality becomes clearer. Bills. Career pressure. Immigration paperwork. Long-term plans. Suddenly, life becomes less about adventure and more about survival. That night we sat at our usual table in the coffee shop, but the atmosphere felt different. She stared at her cup for a moment before speaking. Sometimes I wonder if I made the right decision moving here. Her voice was calm, but I could hear the weight behind the sentence. I understood immediately. Because I had asked myself the exact same question many times. Living in a new country often creates what psychologists call identity tension. Your past life and your current life feel like two separate worlds. The person you were back home and the person you are becoming abroad do not always feel the same. And navigating that space requires emotional strength. For a few minutes we talked honestly about the challenges. Work stress. Distance from family. The pressure to succeed. The invisible effort of speaking English every day. Something interesting happens when two people share their struggles openly. Instead of making the relationship weaker, honesty often strengthens it. Researchers studying relationships call this vulnerability bonding. When people reveal their fears and uncertainties, trust grows deeper. That evening our conversation was not romantic. It was real. I thought life here would feel clearer by now, she admitted. Me too, I said. We both laughed softly. Sometimes laughter appears in serious conversations not because things are funny, but because it releases emotional pressure. But the challenges did not stop there. Over the next few weeks, our schedules became busier. Work demanded more hours. Some evenings we were too tired to meet. The routine that once felt natural started to change. Relationships often face their first real test during moments like this. Less time. More stress. More uncertainty. Psychologists studying long-term partnerships say that couples who survive early stress usually share one key habit: consistent communication. Not perfect communication. Just honest effort. So we kept talking. Sometimes in person. Sometimes through short messages. Sometimes through long late-night conversations about the future. One night during a walk through the city, the topic of the future appeared more directly than before. "What do you see for yourself here?" she asked. The question was simple, but it carried weight. Future conversations reveal a lot about relationships. When people imagine their future separately, the connection often fades. But when they start imagining a shared future, something important shifts. I thought for a moment before answering. "I want to build something stable here," I said slowly. "A life that feels real." She nodded quietly. "Yes," she said. "Me too." Then she added something unexpected. "But sometimes I'm afraid of failing." Fear of failure is one of the most powerful psychological forces humans experience. Studies from behavioral science show that uncertainty about the future can trigger stress responses similar to physical danger. But here's the interesting part. When two people face uncertainty together, the emotional burden often feels lighter. That night we talked longer than usual. About careers. About where we might live in the future. About family. and about what kind of life we wanted to build in America. For the first time, the conversation felt less like casual friendship and more like planning. Not detailed plans. Just shared direction. At the end of the evening, as we stood outside the coffee shop under the cold winter sky, she said something quietly. "Whatever happens, I'm glad we met here." That sentence stayed in my mind long after we said goodbye that night. Because even though life had started testing us, something else had become clear. The connection between us was no longer based only on easy conversations. It had survived stress, doubt, uncertainty, and relationships that survive those moments often grow stronger afterward. Still, neither of us knew how much stronger this connection would become. Because the next turning point in our story would arrive during a quiet night conversation, one that would lead us to discuss something we had never talked about before. The possibility of building a future together. Not just as friends navigating life in America, but as partners. And that conversation would plant the first seed of an idea that would later grow into something unexpected. An idea about marriage. But not the traditional kind people usually imagine. Something different. Something personal. Something that would eventually become a wedding like no other. The promise we made one night. Some promises are planned for months. Others appear unexpectedly, during a quiet conversation when neither person realizes the moment will change everything. The night we first talked seriously about the future did not begin as an important evening. There was no special occasion, no celebration, no dramatic setting. It was just another normal night after a long workday in the United States. The air outside was cool, but not freezing like winter. Streetlights reflected softly on the pavement after a light rain earlier that evening. The city felt calm, the kind of calm that makes conversations slower and thoughts a little deeper. We had finished dinner and decided to walk for a while. Walking conversations are interesting from a psychological perspective. Researchers have found that people often speak more honestly when walking side by side instead of sitting face to face. The body relaxes, eye contact becomes less intense, and thoughts flow more naturally. That night, that theory proved very true. For the first few minutes we talked about ordinary things, work, small plans for the weekend, a funny story about a coworker who had accidentally scheduled 2 meetings at the same time. Normal conversation. Then there was a quiet moment. The kind of silence that doesn't feel awkward, just thoughtful. She slowed her steps slightly and looked up at the buildings around us. "Do you ever think about how strange life is?" she asked. I smiled. "Sometimes." She continued walking for a moment before explaining what she meant. "A few years ago we didn't know each other," she said. "We lived completely different lives. Different places. Different routines." She paused and looked at me briefly. "And now we're here." It was a simple observation, but it carried something deeper. Human relationships often create this feeling of quiet amazement, the realization that chance, timing, and small decisions can connect 2 lives in unexpected ways. I nodded. "Yes," I said. "Life is strange like that." For a few seconds we walked in silence again. Then she asked a question that made the conversation turn in a new direction. "Do you see yourself staying in America long term?" That question felt heavier than it sounded. Future questions always do. Psychologists explain that when people start asking long-term questions in relationships, it often signals a shift from present-focused thinking to future-oriented thinking. The brain begins imagining shared timelines. I took a moment before answering. Yes, I said slowly. I think so. I want to build something stable here. She looked thoughtful. I feel the same way, she said. Then she laughed softly. But sometimes the future still feels uncertain. That honesty made the conversation easier. Uncertainty is something most people living abroad understand very well. Immigration policies, job opportunities, family distance, many factors can affect long-term plans. Yet uncertainty also creates a strange type of courage. When the future is not guaranteed, people learn to focus more on the present. That night our conversation gradually became more personal than ever before. We talked about childhood memories. About the families we missed. About the dreams we once had when we were younger. One question led to another. Did you ever imagine living in America? She asked. Not exactly like this, I admitted. She laughed again. Yes, me neither. Then something interesting happened. The conversation turned toward relationships. Not in a dramatic or emotional way, just curious, reflective. What do you think makes a relationship work? She asked. It was a thoughtful question. I considered it for a moment before answering. I think honesty, I said. And patience. She nodded slowly. Yes. Patience is important. Then she added something quietly. And choosing each other again and again. That sentence stayed in the air for a moment. Choosing each other again and again. Relationship psychologists often talk about commitment not as a single decision but as a series of repeated choices. Long-term partnerships succeed when both people continue choosing the relationship during difficult moments. Looking back now, that sentence felt like the beginning of something. But at that moment, we were simply talking. Eventually we reached a small park bench and sat down. The city around us had grown quieter. A few cars passed occasionally, but the streets felt peaceful. After a moment she asked another question. Do you believe people can build a life together in a new country? The question surprised me slightly. But the answer felt clear. Yes, I said. If they support each other. She looked at me thoughtfully. Then she said something that felt almost like a promise. Then maybe that's what matters most. Not a formal promise. Not a dramatic declaration. Just a quiet agreement between two people sharing a bench under city lights. In relationship research, moments like this are sometimes called defining conversations. They are not official commitments, but they establish shared values and expectations. That night we did not talk about marriage. We did not plan a wedding. But we did something just as important. We acknowledged that our lives were becoming connected. When we finally stood up to walk back, the air felt cooler and the streets even quieter than before. Before saying goodbye, she looked at me and smiled. I'm glad we're figuring this journey out together. Me too, I replied. And in that simple exchange, something invisible had changed. We had crossed a quiet line. Not just friends. Not just two people learning English in the same coffee shop. But two people beginning to imagine a shared future. Of course, imagining the future is one thing. Turning that vision into reality is something very different. Because soon after that conversation, a new idea would appear in our discussions, an idea that sounded unusual at first. An idea about how a wedding could be different. Simpler. More personal. Less traditional. At that moment we didn't know it yet, but that idea would eventually grow into something unforgettable. A wedding that almost no one expected. And a story that would begin with one simple question. What if we created a wedding that truly reflected our journey? Why we chose a different wedding. Most people imagine weddings long before they actually happen. Elegant venues. Perfect decorations. Hundreds of guests. A schedule carefully planned down to the minute. For many couples, the wedding day becomes a huge production, beautiful, exciting, but also incredibly complicated. But the idea for our wedding started in a completely different way. It started with a question. And not the usual question. One evening, months after that quiet promise we made during our walk, we were sitting again in our familiar coffee shop. By then, the place had become part of our routine. The barista knew our orders. The corner table near the window almost felt like ours. Outside, the weather had started changing. Winter was slowly giving way to early spring. The air felt softer, and people seemed happier walking through the streets. We had just finished talking about work when she suddenly asked something unexpected. What kind of wedding would you want someday? The question appeared so casually that it took me a moment to realize what she had said. Not if. What kind? Psychologists often point out that language reveals hidden intentions. When people begin speaking about the future in specific ways, it usually means they have already imagined that future privately. So I smiled and answered honestly. I'm not sure, I said. Probably something simple. She leaned back slightly, thinking. Simple sounds nice, she said. Then she added something interesting. I've seen so many big weddings in America. Beautiful, but sometimes they look stressful. She wasn't wrong. The average wedding in the United States can cost tens of thousands of dollars. Planning often takes months or even years. Couples organize guest lists, seating charts, decorations, photography schedules, music playlists, and endless details. For some people, that process is exciting. For others, it becomes overwhelming. In fact, psychologists studying relationships have found that wedding planning can sometimes increase stress levels for couples instead of reducing them. Expectations from family, financial pressure, and logistical complexity all play a role. We both understood that feeling. Our journey together had never been about big performances. It had been about quiet conversations, shared struggles, and simple moments. Coffee. Walks. Late night talks about the future. So the idea of a massive, complicated wedding didn't quite match our story. After a moment of silence, she asked another question. What if a wedding could be more personal? I looked at her curiously. What do you mean? She smiled slightly, as if she had been thinking about this idea for a while. Something smaller. Something that tells our story. That sentence stayed in my mind. A wedding that tells a story. Sociologists who study marriage traditions often explain that weddings serve two purposes. First, they celebrate commitment between two people. Second, they communicate identity, who the couple is, what they value, and how they see their future. Traditional ceremonies communicate tradition. Large weddings communicate community. But personal weddings communicate something different. Authenticity. The more we talked, the more the idea began to grow. Instead of focusing on what weddings are supposed to look like, we started asking what kind of experience would feel meaningful to us. What if we invite only the people who really know our journey, she suggested. What if the ceremony is somewhere that feels peaceful? I added. What if we write our own vows? Each question made the idea more interesting. But there was another important reason behind our thinking. Our relationship had grown slowly, through patience and understanding. It wasn't built on grand gestures or dramatic moments. It was built on many small steps, awkward English conversations, cultural discoveries, emotional support during stressful times. That journey deserved a wedding that reflected it. Not loud. Not complicated. Just real. During that conversation we also talked about something many couples experience when planning weddings, the pressure to meet expectations. Family expectations. Social expectations. Cultural expectations. Sometimes people organize weddings not because they want them, but because they feel obligated. But psychologists who study happiness often say that meaningful life events feel most satisfying when they align with personal values rather than external pressure. And our values were becoming clearer. Connection. Authenticity. Shared memories. So the conversation slowly turned into a decision. Not a final plan yet. Just a direction. We would design a wedding that felt like us. A wedding shaped by our story in America, two people from different backgrounds learning language, culture, and life together. Before leaving the coffee shop that night, she said something that made me laugh. If we do this, she said, people might think we're strange. Maybe, I replied. But strange can be good. She smiled. Yes, sometimes the best stories are strange. Looking back now, that conversation was the moment the idea truly began. Not the proposal. Not the ceremony. Just the idea. An idea about creating something unique. Something simple. Something meaningful. Of course, ideas are easy. Turning ideas into reality requires planning. And planning a wedding, even a simple one, brings its own challenges, surprises, and unexpected moments. Soon we would begin discussing where this unusual wedding might happen, who would be there, and how we could turn a quiet idea into a real celebration. And the more we planned, the more we realized something surprising. Our wedding was going to look very different from what most people expected. Different in ways that would make friends curious. Different in ways that would make family ask questions. But also different in a way that made the entire experience feel unforgettable. Because sometimes the most meaningful celebrations are not the biggest ones. They are the ones that tell the most honest story. And our story, built slowly through language, culture, and patience, was ready to become something new. A wedding unlike any we had seen before. Planning a wedding like no other. The moment you decide to plan a wedding that's different, something interesting happens. Everyone suddenly becomes very curious. Some people get excited. Some people get confused. And a few people look at you like you've just suggested getting married on the moon. That was exactly the reaction we started receiving when our unusual wedding idea slowly became real. At first, the plan existed only in our conversations. It was just an idea we discussed during walks, coffee shop talks, and quiet evenings. But eventually, every idea reaches a moment where it either disappears or becomes a plan. One Saturday afternoon, we sat down with notebooks and started asking the practical questions. Where should the wedding happen? Who should be there? What would the ceremony look like? And most importantly, how could we make the day feel meaningful without turning it into a stressful event? Wedding planning in America is almost like its own industry. There are planners, designers, photographers, caterers, venue coordinators, dress consultants, and endless online checklists explaining every tiny detail. But the more we researched, the more we realized something. Most of those details were not actually important to us. What mattered was the experience. Psychologists studying life satisfaction often explain that meaningful events create stronger memories when they focus on emotional connection rather than visual perfection. In simple words, people remember how a moment felt much more than how expensive it looked. That idea became our guide. So we began planning a wedding that focused on three things: the story, the people, the moment. The first big decision was location. Many couples in the United States choose large venues, hotels, event halls, or luxury outdoor spaces. But those places often host hundreds of guests and follow strict schedules. That didn't feel like our style. Our story had started in small places, a coffee shop, quiet streets, simple conversations. We wanted the wedding environment to reflect that same feeling. One evening while walking through a nearby park, we noticed a small open area surrounded by tall trees. The sunlight filtered gently through the branches, and the entire space felt calm and private. We stopped walking. "This place feels peaceful," she said. I looked around and nodded. Yes, it does. In that moment, a thought appeared almost simultaneously in both our minds. What if the wedding happened here? Not in a giant venue. Not in a ballroom. Just outdoors, in a place that felt natural and quiet. Outdoor weddings are actually quite popular in parts of the United States, especially in parks or gardens. They create a relaxed atmosphere and allow couples to personalize the environment. Still, choosing a park ceremony felt slightly bold. What if the weather changes? I asked. She laughed. Then we'll have a story to tell. That answer captured something important about our relationship. We had already learned that life rarely goes exactly as planned. Living in a new country had taught us flexibility, patience, and humor during unexpected situations. So the idea of an outdoor ceremony felt right. The next question was guest list. Traditional weddings sometimes include hundreds of guests, extended family, coworkers, acquaintances, distant relatives. But when we imagined our ceremony, we kept picturing something smaller. Something more intimate. So we made a simple rule. Invite only the people who had truly been part of our journey. Friends who supported us. Coworkers who encouraged us. A few family members who could travel. When the list was finished, it was surprisingly short. But it felt perfect. Another interesting part of the planning process was writing our vows. In many American weddings, couples write personal vows instead of repeating traditional phrases. This allows them to speak directly about their relationship, their journey, and their hopes for the future. At first, the idea felt intimidating. Writing personal vows means expressing emotions clearly. In English. For someone who once struggled with simple conversations, that challenge felt almost poetic. The same language that had once made me nervous in coffee shops would now become the language of a wedding promise. But that challenge also felt meaningful. Language experts often say that emotional communication strengthens language learning because the brain connects words with personal experience. When you express real feelings in another language, those words become deeply memorable. So writing those vows slowly became one of the most meaningful parts of the preparation. Late at night, I sometimes sat at my desk thinking about the journey that brought us here. The first awkward conversation. The coffee shop mornings. The cultural discoveries. The difficult moments when life tested us. All those memories were now becoming part of a promise. Of course, not everyone immediately understood our plan. When we told friends that our wedding would be small, outdoors, and highly personal, reactions varied. Some people said it sounded beautiful. Others asked practical questions. Are you sure you don't want something bigger? What about a formal reception? Will there be traditional elements? But every time those questions appeared, we returned to the same idea. This wedding was not about expectations. It was about authenticity. And slowly, as the planning continued, the entire event began to take shape. A peaceful park ceremony. A small group of meaningful guests. Personal vows. Simple decorations. And a celebration focused on connection instead of performance. Looking back now, those planning weeks were some of the most exciting moments of our relationship. Not because everything was perfect, but because every decision reflected the same journey that brought us together. Two people building something real in a new country. Still, one big moment was approaching. The actual day. The day when this unusual plan would finally become reality. And as that day grew closer, a surprising feeling appeared. Not nervousness. Not stress. Just quiet excitement. Because sometimes the most meaningful celebrations are not the most complicated ones. They are simply the ones that feel true to the story behind them. And soon, our story was about to reach the moment we had imagined for months. A wedding day unlike any other. The day our unique wedding happened. Most weddings begin with a schedule. Ours began with sunlight. Not dramatic sunlight like in a movie scene, just a quiet, gentle morning where the sky looked clear and the air felt calm. The kind of morning where everything seems slightly slower, as if the day itself understands something meaningful is about to happen. I woke up earlier than usual that day. Not because I was nervous. Actually, the feeling was surprisingly peaceful. Researchers who study major life events often say that anticipation can create two very different emotional responses, anxiety or clarity. When people organize events that truly reflect their values, the brain often experiences less stress and more calm focus. That morning felt exactly like that. Clear. Simple. Real. Our wedding day had arrived. Instead of rushing through a crowded hotel hallway or preparing in a busy event center, the morning started quietly. A few close friends helped with small preparations. Someone brought coffee. Someone else checked decorations for the park area. Nothing felt complicated. Just people helping. One of the interesting things about smaller weddings is that the atmosphere becomes more collaborative. Instead of a huge staff managing everything, friends naturally become part of the experience. And that made the entire day feel warmer. Around mid-morning we arrived at the park where the ceremony would take place. The space looked even more beautiful than we remembered during those early planning walks. Tall trees surrounded the small open area, and soft sunlight filtered through the leaves. Nature has a powerful effect on human emotion. Studies in environmental psychology show that natural settings reduce stress and increase feelings of connection between people. Standing there, I understood exactly why. The entire environment felt peaceful. A few chairs had been arranged for our guests. Simple flowers decorated the small ceremony space. Nothing extravagant, just gentle details that made the area feel welcoming. Guests started arriving slowly. Friends from work. A few family members. People who had shared parts of our journey in America. Instead of a crowd of strangers, every face felt familiar. That alone changed the energy of the day. Large weddings can sometimes feel like public performances. Couples greet dozens or hundreds of guests, often feeling pressure to move quickly between conversations. But our gathering felt more like a meaningful reunion. People talked quietly. They laughed. They shared small stories about how we had met. One coworker even joked about our coffee shop conversations becoming legendary. And then, finally, the moment arrived. The ceremony began. In the United States, wedding ceremonies can vary widely depending on the couple's preferences. Some follow religious traditions. Others are completely personalized. Ours leaned towards something very simple. A close friend agreed to officiate the ceremony, someone who knew our story and could speak about it naturally. As everyone settled into their seats, I looked around the small gathering. For a brief moment, I thought about the journey that led to this exact point. The early days of uncertainty in America. The awkward English conversations. The quiet support during stressful moments. The walks, the laughter, the discoveries about culture and life. Every step had led here. When she walked toward the ceremony space, the atmosphere became even quieter. Not the nervous silence of a large crowd, but the gentle attention of people witnessing something personal. She looked happy, calm, and completely present. Our friend began the ceremony with a few simple words about journeys. Not just romantic journeys, but life journeys, the unexpected paths that bring people together. Then came the moment that had once seemed intimidating. Our vows. Writing those vows had taken many late nights of reflection. Finding the right words in English felt important because that language had become part of our shared story. When it was my turn, I spoke slowly. Not because I was nervous, but because every word mattered. I talked about the first coffee shop conversation, about the cultural discoveries, about the patience required when two people build a life in a new country, and about the quiet promise we made during that walk months earlier, to face uncertainty together. When she read her vows, the words were simple but powerful. She spoke about courage, about learning, and about choosing each other again and again, even when life becomes complicated. Many guests smiled. A few quietly wiped their eyes. Emotional moments like this are actually common during weddings. Neuroscience research shows that shared emotional experiences trigger the release of oxytocin, often called the bonding hormone. This chemical strengthens feelings of trust and connection among people witnessing the event. In simple words, meaningful ceremonies bring people closer. Finally, the moment arrived. The official declaration. Our friend smiled warmly. By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you married." Applause broke the quiet atmosphere as we laughed and embraced. Just like that, the ceremony was complete. No fireworks. No dramatic music. Just a simple moment where two lives officially became one shared path. Afterward, the celebration continued in the same relaxed style. Friends talked, shared food, and enjoyed the peaceful park environment. Instead of rushing through a strict schedule, the day unfolded naturally. People told stories. Someone played music from a small speaker. And the entire event felt more like a meaningful gathering than a formal performance. Later that evening, as the sun began setting behind the trees, I looked around at the small group of people still talking and laughing together. That was the moment I realized something important. Our wedding had not been large. It had not been extravagant. But it had been exactly what we hoped for. Personal. Honest. Unforgettable. And in many ways, it represented the entire journey we had taken in America. Two people starting with simple conversations. And building something meaningful step by step. But the wedding day, as beautiful as it was only one chapter of the story. The real adventure would begin afterward. Because marriage is not the ending of a love story. It is the beginning of a completely new one. Life after our unusual wedding. Something interesting happens after the wedding day ends. The music stops. The decorations disappear. Guests go back to their homes. And suddenly, the two people at the center of the celebration wake up the next morning facing something much quieter, real life. Movies rarely show that part. They end with the ceremony, the kiss, the applause. But in reality, the wedding is not the final chapter of the story. It's more like the first page of a new one. The morning after our unusual wedding felt surprisingly normal. Sunlight came through the window just like any other day. The city outside moved at its usual pace, cars passing, people walking dogs, coffee shops opening their doors for early customers. For a moment, it almost felt strange. After months of planning and one emotional day in the park, life simply continued. But that quiet continuation is actually one of the most beautiful parts of marriage. Psychologists who study long-term relationships often say that successful partnerships are built not on dramatic moments, but on daily micro-connections, small interactions repeated consistently over time. Morning conversations. Shared meals. Short messages during busy days. Those tiny moments slowly build the foundation of a life together. And that was exactly how our new chapter began. The first big change was something subtle. We started making decisions together about everyday life. Where to live. How to organize our schedules. What kind of routines made both of us feel balanced. Living in the United States already required adaptability. Work schedules could change quickly. Opportunities appeared unexpectedly. Sometimes plans had to adjust. But now those adjustments were shared. Two people navigating life together. Interestingly, researchers studying marriage satisfaction have found that couples who approach challenges as shared problems instead of individual struggles report significantly higher levels of happiness. In simple words, saying we'll figure this out together changes everything. And that mindset became one of the quiet strengths of our relationship. Another interesting part of married life involved something we had both been practicing since the beginning, communication in English. Our early conversations had been slow and careful. Now they were much more natural. But we still occasionally laughed about language mistakes. One evening while cooking dinner, I tried to describe a new recipe idea. "I think we should add more flavor feeling," I said. She raised an eyebrow. "Flavor feeling?" I paused. "Flavor, strength?" She laughed. "You mean seasoning?" "Yes." "Seasoning," I said. Moments like that reminded us of the journey we had taken. Language learning never truly stops. Even native speakers discover new expressions all the time. But using English in everyday married life created constant practice. Talking about work. Planning trips. Discussing future goals. Each conversation became another opportunity to grow. Language researchers call this contextual learning. The brain absorbs language faster when it's connected to real-life situations rather than isolated study sessions. And marriage provides endless real-life conversations. Of course, life after the wedding was not perfect. No relationship is. There were still stressful days at work. Occasional misunderstandings. Moments when the challenges of living far from family felt heavier. But something important had changed. We were no longer facing those moments alone. One evening after a long workday, we decided to walk through the same park where our wedding ceremony had happened. The space looked almost identical: tall trees, quiet paths, soft evening light. Standing there again felt surreal. "This is where everything changed," she said. I smiled. "Yes, it is." Then she said something thoughtful. "You know what's funny?" "What?" "We spent so much time planning the wedding, but the real story is happening now." She was right. Sociologists who study marriage often explain that the ceremony itself is symbolic. The deeper meaning of marriage appears during the years afterward, the shared experiences, the growth, the way two lives slowly integrate. Our story in America continued evolving. Career opportunities improved. We built stronger friendships in our community. And gradually, the city that once felt unfamiliar started to feel like home. Occasionally we still visited the coffee shop where everything began. The barista remembered us immediately. "Hey! The famous coffee couple," he joked one morning. Apparently our story had become a small legend among the regular customers. We laughed and ordered our usual drinks. Sitting at the same corner table, it was easy to remember the early days. The nervous conversations, the simple sentences, the quiet curiosity about each other. Those memories now felt like the opening chapters of a long book. And the book was still being written. Because marriage is not a final destination. It is a journey. A journey filled with ordinary days that slowly become meaningful memories. Looking back at our unusual wedding, I realized something important. The ceremony had not been about impressing people. It had been about honoring the path that brought us together. A path built through patience, culture, language, and trust. And as our life continued unfolding in America, one realization became clearer every year. The most extraordinary stories often grow from the simplest beginnings. A small coffee shop. A slow English conversation. A shared dream about the future. But the deeper lesson behind that journey, the lesson about love, courage, and persistence, would only become fully clear later. And that final realization is the most important part of this entire story. The real lesson behind our wedding story. The strange thing about life stories is that the biggest lesson often hides inside the smallest moment. Not the wedding. Not the applause. Not even the promises spoken during the ceremony. For our story, the real lesson began long before the wedding day ever happened, in a tiny coffee shop, with a simple sentence spoken in slow English. Cold morning today. Looking back now, it's almost funny. At the time, that sentence felt ordinary. Just a polite comment between two strangers standing in line for coffee. But in reality, it was the first small step that led to everything else. A friendship. A relationship. A shared life in a new country. And eventually, a wedding that turned out to be very different from traditional ones. Human life often works exactly like that. Psychologists studying personal success frequently talk about something called the compound effect. It means that small actions, repeated consistently over time, create powerful long-term results. A short conversation today. A new connection tomorrow. A deeper relationship months later. Then suddenly, years later, you look around and realize your entire life has changed. Not because of one dramatic decision, but because of hundreds of small moments. Our story in America followed that exact pattern. When I first arrived in the United States, I thought success would come from big achievements, perfect English, major career milestones, clear long-term plans. But life taught me something much more realistic. Progress usually begins with imperfect steps. Awkward conversations. Simple words. Small risks that feel uncomfortable at first. Language learning works the same way. Many people believe they must speak English perfectly before using it in real life. But neuroscience research shows the opposite is true. The brain develops language skills faster when people use the language actively, even with mistakes. Mistakes create learning signals in the brain. Each correction strengthens memory pathways. Each real conversation builds confidence. So those early awkward sentences, the ones that felt slow or imperfect, were actually building the foundation for something much bigger. And not just for language. For life. Because communication is the doorway to connection. Connection leads to opportunity. Opportunity leads to change. That simple chain reaction explains why something as small as a coffee shop conversation can eventually lead to something as meaningful as a marriage. Another lesson from this journey involves courage. Not the dramatic, movie-style courage people imagine. Just quiet courage. The courage to start a conversation. The courage to keep trying when learning feels difficult. The courage to build a life in a place that once felt unfamiliar. Behavioral scientists often describe courage as action in the presence of uncertainty. It doesn't mean fear disappears. It means you move forward anyway. And moving forward, even slowly, creates momentum. Momentum creates new possibilities. Sometimes those possibilities appear in surprising forms. For us, that possibility eventually became a wedding. But not the kind most people expect. Our wedding was not designed to impress anyone. It was designed to reflect our story. A story built through patience. Through learning. Through shared experiences in a country that had once felt completely new to both of us. That's why we chose a simple ceremony in a peaceful park. That's why we invited only people who truly knew our journey. And that's why the entire event felt so meaningful. Because authenticity has a powerful emotional effect. Psychological studies on life satisfaction consistently show that people feel happiest when their actions align with their values. When you design your life according to what truly matters to you, not just social expectations, the results often feel deeper and more lasting. Our unusual wedding was simply an expression of that idea. A celebration of a journey rather than a performance. But perhaps the most important lesson from this story connects back to something many people struggle with: motivation. Learning a language. Building a career. Starting a new life. These goals can feel overwhelming. At times, it's tempting to give up. But what most people don't realize is that progress is rarely visible in the moment. When you practice English today, the improvement might feel small. When you take one small step toward a new opportunity, the impact might seem invisible. But those actions accumulate. Quietly. Patiently. Until one day you suddenly notice something surprising. You're having full conversations in a language that once felt impossible. You're living in a place that once felt unfamiliar. You're sharing your life with someone who once was a stranger. And maybe, you're standing in a peaceful park surrounded by friends, celebrating a wedding that tells the story of that entire journey. All of it started with small steps. Small courage. Small conversations. That's why this story matters. Not because of the wedding itself, but because of the path that led there. A path built one simple moment at a time. So if you're watching this video while feeling stuck, tired, or discouraged about learning English or chasing a dream, remember something important. The next step does not have to be big. It just has to exist. One conversation. One new word. One small moment of courage. Because sometimes the most extraordinary stories begin exactly that way. Quietly. Unexpectedly. With a sentence so simple that nobody realizes it might change everything. Good morning. And that might be the beginning of your story too. Before you click away, there's one question I want you to think about. What if the moment that changes your life hasn't happened yet? Most people imagine life-changing events as something dramatic. A huge opportunity. A perfect plan. A clear turning point where everything suddenly makes sense. But real life rarely works like that. More often, the moments that shape our future arrive quietly. A random conversation with someone you almost didn't talk to. A new word you finally decide to learn today. A small decision that seems meaningless right now, but slowly changes your direction. That's exactly how this entire story began. Not with a grand plan. Not with confidence. Just with a simple moment of curiosity, and the courage to say a few imperfect words. And here's the truth most people never realize. Every day, you're standing at the edge of moments like that. Moments that could open new friendships. New opportunities. New versions of yourself. But those moments only become real if you step into them. If you speak. If you try. If you keep moving forward even when progress feels slow. Because the life you want isn't built in one big leap. It's built in small steps that stack together over time. And sometimes, those small steps lead to places you never expected. A new country. A new career. A new love story. Or a completely different version of your life. So the real question isn't whether something extraordinary will happen in your future. The real question is, will you take the small step today that begins that future? If this story made you think, inspired you, or reminded you that small courage matters, then this channel was created exactly for you. Here on this channel, we share real-life stories, powerful English learning moments, and inspiring journeys that show how ordinary people create extraordinary lives, one step at a time. And trust me, some of the most surprising stories are still coming. Stories about unexpected friendships, life-changing opportunities, and moments that completely rewrite someone's future. So if you don't want to miss the next story, make sure you subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and join this growing community of learners and dreamers from around the world. Because the next video might tell a story that feels a lot like yours. And who knows? Maybe one day, your story will be the one that inspires someone else. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and never underestimate the power of one small moment. See you in the next story.